British Renaissance literature. My specialty is in Milton and the 17th century, but in practice I probably teach more Shakespeare because of our class rotation. And recently I've been teaching a course on the Lord of the Rings with various levels of engagement from the students. It's been great fun, and so I've been thinking a lot about Tolkien's world as well as Lewis's worlds that they've been creating. And when last night David emailed me and said, "Do you need anything besides a mic?" And I emailed back and I said, "I'm old-fashioned, which means boring." And I said, "Unless you can accommodate some marionettes and a one-man tango dance." And he didn't write me back. So if it's a boring lecture, I'm just going to blame him, because I had the marionettes all ready to go. I think as David was advertising this, it had a different title, and as I was revising some of this, I came up with a different title. So the title now is called Music and Methexis, Creation and Temptation in Lewis's The Magician's Nephew and Tolkien's The Silmarillion. C.S. Lewis and j.r.r. Tolkien are two of the 20th century's great myth makers. In their myth-making, Lewis was consciously offering allegories of the Christian life, where narrative episodes in the Chronicles of Narnia are legitimately transformed into symbols or suggestive bits of theology about the Christian journey. In all fairness, Lewis preferred to think of his myth-making as offering supposals, that's his word, rather than straight allegory. In his reckoning, Aslan does not just represent the deity, but Lewis imagines Aslan as an answer to the question, what might Christ become like if there really were a world like Narnia, and he chose to be incarnate and die and rise again in that world, as he actually had done in ours. For him, our imaginations are invited to participate and to supplement his own myth-making, a dimension of reader participation and interpretation that goes beyond simple allegory, which conventionally argues that this thing in the text really stands for that thing outside of the text in a symbolic relationship. Unlike Lewis, Tolkien hated allegory, and he categorically rejected it in his letters to various people, repeatedly stating that his work was only about itself, and its purpose was only to amuse and delight, and this chiefly himself. Like Lewis's idea of supposals, Tolkien preferred to think of his own myth-making work as being invested in what he calls applicability. For him, allegory freezes the meaning of something in its historical context and fuses it with the intentions of the author. Applicability, however, frees the narrative from those constraints and offers itself to the reader's horizon of experience. But in a revealing letter to one of his Jesuit friends, dated December 1953, on the eve of the publication of The Lord of the Rings, he seems to indicate the possibility for some allegorical interpretation, writing that, quote, "The Lord of the Rings is, of course, a fundamentally religious and Catholic work, unconsciously so at first, but consciously in the revision," end quote. So those of you who have read the novel can readily attest that the world of Middle-earth is oddly devoid of religion, prayer, gods, or goddesses who are invoked for aid, or cultic rituals or practices. This, despite his assertion that it is fundamentally religious and Catholic to boot. So in our time together, I want to put some pressure on the fundamentally religious worlds that Lewis and Tolkien invent, explicit in the one and implicit in the other, through two related avenues of narrative and theology, creation and temptation, as represented in Lewis's The Magician's Nephew, and in Tolkien's mythology of the elves called the Silmarillion, as well as some choice passages from The Lord of the Rings. Lewis and Tolkien depict the act of creation through the metaphor of music, and I intend to tease out a possible connection between their use of that metaphor and the ancient idea of Methexis, a concept that describes the participatory relationship between material things in the world and the eternal ideas from which they derived. And this is chiefly developed in Plato's philosophy. And also the relationship between the creator and the created in early Christian theology, having to do with understanding the nature of the being of God and the nature of existence. So I mean here to be suggestive more than anything. I'm not offering a tightly constructed argument, but I do hope we may have some time for some discussion afterwards. So my first section is called Creation Through Destruction. The lavish abundance of the mythic worlds of these two Oxford professors create, ironically grows out of their own experiences with large-scale destruction as soldiers on the Western Front in World War I, sometimes called the Great War or the War to End All Wars. And it was certainly a great war, involving most of Europe and the United States, but it certainly did not end all wars. The literary critic Roger Sale has called the Great War, quote, the single event most responsible for shaping the modern idea that heroism is dead. The Great War soured even the most idealistic because of the immense burden of loss. On average, 6,000 men were killed every day in a war that lasted 1,566 days. 6 million men were lost in Britain alone. This is an entire generation. Previous to those years, most Europeans and many Americans were invested in the myth of progress, the idea that humanity is getting better and better, evolving into more sophisticated thinkers and builders of civilization, aided by the rapid growth of technology that could end war altogether. Quote, the least informed of us realizes that the whole trend of history is against the tendency for men to attack the ideals and the beliefs of other men, declared one best-selling book in 1909. How can we possibly expect to keep alive warlike qualities, this author continues, when all of our interests are activities, all our environments, in short, are peace-like, end quote. But the war shattered all of that as new technologies, mustard gas, machine guns, shells that could be launched from a mile away, only created new avenues of death. The war was, in the words of one historian, quote, like a colossal machine chewing up men and munitions like so much raw material. Disintegration and fragmentation, the ruins of civilization, and the human creature were the legacies of the Great War. It may seem counterintuitive then, that in the midst of this fragmentation, there was an accompanying return to myth and the medieval quest romance. As the literary critic Paul Fussell has discussed in his masterful book, The Great War and Modern Memory, soldiers' letters are saturated with the language of journey, of strangeness, of ritual and conversion, of quest, of death and resurrection. And the most popular by far of any book carried by soldiers and read to pieces in the trench was John Bunyan's 17th century bestseller, Pilgrim's Progress, with abundant allusions to the Slough of Despond, the Valley of the Shadow of Death, the Talons of Apollyon, the city of destruction, and visions of the celestial city appearing in the forms of reinforcements, supplies, and welcome sleep. The war's technology of death had forced a moment of unprecedented meaning. How do we make sense of all of this death and suffering? And the lenses of the great myths of the past helped to structure how soldiers understood and interpreted their own trauma. Tolkien was a second lieutenant on the Western Front and fought at the Battle of the Somme in the River Valley in France, July 1916. It was one of the fiercest concentrations of human killing in the history of human conflict. The trench warfare described by Tolkien as, quote, animal horror. In diaries and letters, many soldiers expressed their hope for receiving what they called a blighty wound that would send them back to hospital. And many of these were self-inflicted. So these would be, wounds that would damage you enough that would send you back to the hospital, but weren't life-threatening. Tolkien escaped without being wounded, having become a victim of trench fever caused by being bitten by lice. When his fever stubbornly refused to die down, he was returned to the hospital in England, where he began working in earnest on the mythology that would become the Silmarillion, the history of the elves of Middle-earth, and the deep history of the Lord of the Rings. After convalescence, when he returned to Oxford in 1918, all but one of his closest friends was a casualty of the Great War. Lewis, younger than Tolkien, arrived late to the front in November 1917, was also commissioned as a second lieutenant, and lived and fought in the trenches for 6 months. The experience seared his heart, leaving him with sustained periods of grief as he tried to deal with memories of, quote, the horribly smashed men still moving like half-crushed beetles, the sitting or standing corpses, the landscape of sheer earth without a blade of grass. He was wounded when a shell exploded near him in a German counterattack, and he returned to London for convalescence in May of 1918. Artists, poets, and novelists in the wake of the Great War became cynical and sardonic. It was for them the end of faith, not only in human beings, but in God. Both had failed. 5 years before his own conversion to Christianity, the American poet T.S. Eliot expressed the despair of his generation, the aftershocks of the Great War, in his 1922 poem, The Wasteland. And I've just got a few lines from this poem. Where are the roots that clutch? What branches grow out of this stony rubbish? Son of man, you cannot say or guess, for you know only a heap of broken images, where the sun beats and the dead tree gives no shelter, the cricket no relief, and the dry stone no sound of water. Only there is shadow under this red rock. Come in under the shadow of this red rock, and I will show you something different from either your shadow at morning striding behind you, or your shadow at evening rising to meet you. I will show you fear in a handful of dust. In medieval and Renaissance poetry, the sun had always been a symbolic image of the visible presence of God. But in these lines, spoken in mockery of a prophetic voice, Eliot's sun beats down mercilessly upon a fragmented landscape that offers no growth, no escape, and no comfort, even the shadow of oneself, both in the potential of movement and striding forward in the morning, and in its attempt at offering blessing by rising to meet its owner at the end of the day, is short-circuited in and by the grave, the handful of dust that is the reduction of human life. One might hear an echo of Hamlet's assessment of human potential here, that despite our being, quote, noble in reason, infinite in faculties, in form and moving, how express and admirable in action, how like an angel in an apprehension, how like a god, the beauty of the world, the paragon of animals. We are inevitably diminished in Hamlet's eyes to our essence, this quintessence of dust. Quite simply, for Hamlet at that moment, there is no there. Similarly, Virginia Woolf's 1925 novel, Mrs. Dalloway, features a day in the lives of two characters. A surfacey titular character who's preparing a dinner party for her high society friends, and a World War I veteran named Septimus Smith, who suffers from shell shock, sees the ghosts of dead soldiers, and eventually takes his life because he cannot re-assimilate into civilized society. In one incident, several characters in various locations around London look up in the sky to see a plane skywriting, but none of them can discern what it says. Some of them think that the word that it's spelling is toffee. Some of them think that the word it's spelling is glaxo, and some think that the word is cremo. It's pretty different words, two of them nonsensical. But it's one of the several devastating symbolic critiques in the novel over the possibility of belief in some ordered, transcendent, and fundamental meaning governing human life and action. The world was, rather, a place that, quote, wavered and quivered and threatened to burst into flames. So both Tolkien and Lewis were countercultural than their modernist peers in this way. The University of Oxford in the 1920s was a hotbed of atheism and jaded views of human potential. But Lewis and Tolkien believed that violence, grief, and unimaginable suffering could be the setting for authentic heroism, courage, friendship, and compassion. So it's from within the framework of horrific destruction that we must begin to address how Lewis and Tolkien represent the creation of fragile and beautiful things in The Magician's Nephew and The Silmarillion. The novel that comprises the first narrative movement of the Chronicles of Narnia, The Magician's Nephew, was actually the last that Lewis wrote for the series. It's a kind of flashback that gives prior context to the other novels as it deals with the creation of Narnia. You might recall, if you're familiar with the novel, that after the protagonists Diggory and Polly bring Queen Jadis to London, she wreaks havoc, and Queen Jadis is the White Witch from The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. As she sits astride a horse, striking terror around her, Diggory grasps her ankle and activates the yellow ring that will transport them all from London to the wood between the worlds, sort of a holding station. He does so at considerable cost because he receives a kick in the face from Jadis, but he manages at a third try to hang on to her, at which point the many linked bodies of Diggory, Polly, Uncle Andrew, who's sort of the early villain in the novel, Jadis, a cabbie, and the cabbie's horse named Strawberry, find themselves in the woods. Before any can recover, and in order to get Jadis as far away from London as possible, Polly and Diggory activate the green ring, which transports them to another world. The world in which they appear, however, seems to be a great void, a great nothingness. Quote, "An empty world," Jadis laments, "where my doom has come upon me." Why such a place would be her doom is a separate question that I will get to in a moment. They all soon discover, however, that it is not a place of nothing, but that it is a place of infinite potential and possibility. They have emerged into a nothingness that will become, in fact, is becoming, Narnia. at the precise moment of its creation. Seen, of course, but heard first in song. Diggory's impression of the song is that it came from every direction at once, and even though there seemed to be no distinct tune, the narrator describes that it was, quote, the most beautiful noise he had ever heard. It was so beautiful that he could hardly bear it, end quote. Immediately, the one voice was joined by other voices of a higher register that perfectly harmonized with the original voice. Every star that ever existed in Narnia's skies burst upon the scene all at once. A lively sun arose on the horizon, casting pink and golden light to a valley, a river, mountains, earth, rock, and water. Such tingling beauty inspires the cabby to declare in wonder, "Glory be! I'd have been a much better man all my life if I'd known there were things like this." And then, as all were nearly overwhelmed with its beauty, they saw the singer, Aslan, whose saturated presence caused all, quote, to forget everything else. Jadis, the cruel wielder of the destructible, deplorable word, is driven by hatred and horror. "This is a terrible world," said the witch. "We must fly at once." But still the song continued like rippling waves, and Polly is the one who, quote, was finding the song more and more interesting because she thought she was beginning to see the connection between the music and the things that were happening, end quote. What she discovers is an intimate tissue between the note and the created thing itself. Tolkien, too, was drawn to the metaphor of music for creation as he describes at the beginning of the Silmarillion. The opening chapter is the creation story of Middle-earth, as the one god that he names Iluvatar first makes the Ainur. These are, or the holy ones. These are equivalent to angels in the Judeo-Christian tradition. Like Lewis's Aslan, Tolkien's Iluvatar sings a great song of creation. In Middle-earth, each Ainur, one of these holy ones, they only partly understand a fragment of the great song. Quote, "For each comprehended only that part of the mind of Iluvatar from which he came." Despite their individual and limited perceptions of their creator's thoughts, Iluvatar commands their communal bonds. Quote, "I will now that you make in harmony together a great music, and ye shall show forth your powers in adorning this theme, each with his own thoughts and devices." Notice here that part of Iluvatar's command is that they adorn the theme that's already set into motion. Their songs are highly individual expressions, as each Ainur only plays that fragment of the song that he has been given by Iluvatar, and it's treasured as a respected part of that partial revelation. But these notes are, number one, ultimately ornamental. That's the word that Tolkien uses. Ultimately ornamental as they decorate or accompany Iluvatar's great music. And two, they are collective, where individual identity is subsumed under the authority of another greater than, because this other, that is Iluvatar, grounds its individual identity and grants it expression in the first place. Thus, these holy ones are not singing to reveal all sorts of fascinating things about themselves, but they are singing to reveal the great music of Iluvatar and his glory, In this way, they are like Isaiah's fantastical six-winged holy ones in chapter 6, who cried unto one another and said, Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The whole earth is full of his glory. These angels express their unique vision of God's glory to each other for the purposes of loving and praising God, not for the purposes of justifying their own notes in the song. As Lewis remarks on this biblical passage elsewhere, quote, the more we thus share the heavenly bread between us, the more we all shall have, end quote. So this intimate and abundant connection between creator and created in Lewis's and Tolkien's mythologies, pictured through the metaphor of music, was known as Methexis in the thought of the ancients. It's a term that's often translated as participation, but it has its Greek origins as a term that describes the relationship between a dancer and the dance, an audience and the theater, or the ways that objects in the material realm are derivative of eternal ideas of those things in the mind of the gods. So let me give you just an example, because this is kind of strange. The way that Plato, for instance, thought about material reality is that a chair, like all chairs, participates in the eternal idea of chairness itself, which exists in the minds of the gods. Right? Does that make sense? All chairs are chairs because they participate by form and function in the eternal idea of chairness. And that is the real world, the ultimate reality in Plato's understanding of reality. That's Methexis. In St. Augustine's understanding, Augustine was the great early theologian of the church who was heavily influenced by Platonic philosophy. In his understanding, Methexis is the realization that one's being is derivative, sustained by, and contingent on God's being, as Paul relates on Mars Hill. For in him we live and move and have our being. Acts 17:28. Any mistaken substitute ultimately means that the soul, for Augustine, is participating in death rather than in the life and subsistence of God's being itself. He confesses, quote, my sin consisted in this, that I sought pleasure, sublimity, truth, not in God, but in his creatures, in myself and other created beings, so that I was plunged into miseries, confusions, and errors, end quote. He describes his mistaken loves as his soul's feeding on a diet of the sun and the moon, your beautiful works, as he speaks to God, rather than on the creator of those works. For Augustine, the whole cosmos, even the fallen one, is driven by love and participation. God loves in creating that which is not himself, to give himself completely and ultimately to it. And the creation loves God properly when it finds its deepest delight and joy in God. But sin has broken that dynamic and has redefined it. One, it has redefined where we place our devotion, and two, the degree to which we participate in those things that we love. Evil continues to disrupt and destroy and fragment the human will to return to delight and participation in God's being. But believers like Tolkien and Lewis proclaim what Joseph states to his brothers. Ye thought evil against me, but God meant it unto good. Genesis 50:20. Hence, for believers, God comprehends evil within his song and also overcomes it. So this is part 2, temptation and self-will. The breaking of the song of participation is the nature of every temptation in the Christian faith and in the mythologies of Middle-earth and Narnia. When one sins, what is valued is one's own will, and thus we deny our dependence upon God as one of his creatures. In John Piper's words, our sin means that we belittle the glory of God. So temptation is linked with creation. Sin is defining one's glory and one's vision of the good for oneself, and it is the denial of creation as it's supposed to exist under the authority of God, proclaiming his glory and living by his definitions of the good. Middle-earth and Narnia have their villains, all seeking their own glory and defining their own good. In Tolkien's creation myth, one of the greatest of the Ainur, named Melkor, later to become the master to the evil Sauron of the Lord of the Rings, received the song of Iluvatar, but he sought to, quote, interweave matters of his own imagining that were not in accord with the theme of Iluvatar, and thereby desired to increase the power and glory of the part assigned to him, end quote. So the assertion of his own will above that of Iluvatar causes immediate discord and confusion that grows and spreads to all the other Ainur who are playing in accordance to the theme. And it's such an interruption and a temptation that it leads other Ainur away to imitate Melkor instead of singing the song that they're supposed to be singing. Iluvatar rises and he begins a third song that is even more beautiful and deep, bringing into greater relief the vain and discordant theme of Melkor. But Iluvatar's new song doesn't just outplay Melkor's. Iluvatar's song incorporates Melkor's discord into a swelling movement that ends in a single harmonious chord. He then declares to Melkor, quote, no theme may be played that hath not its uttermost source in me. And he warns that those who attempt to alter the great song, quote, shall prove but mine instrument in the devising of things more wonderful, which he himself hath not imagined, end quote. Here Tolkien recognizes the goodness that God creates beyond our imagining. Even when we feel that the evil of our self-will has ruined us. You might remember that after Aslan is sacrificed in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, and he is resurrected, Susan remarks in wonder, what does this all mean? And Aslan responds, it means that though the witch knew the deep magic, there is a magic deeper still, which she did not know. Melkor does not understand the magic deeper still of Iluvatar's great song. He does not truly repent and remains in exile in darkness and the void. So he has this long struggle against the elves to seduce them to darkness. He's always trying to return by means of guile. We, fortunately, through our repentance, are ushered into the very presence of God as we readjust the notes that we are playing to his song. Something similar happens in The Magician's Nephew. Back in London, the witch had broken the crossbar of a lampstand and used it as a rod to strike her policeman attackers. When she sees Aslan striding towards her during the act of creation, she throws the iron bar at him and strikes him squarely between the eyes. But Aslan continues striding, singing, and creating without notice, and the witch flees in panic with a shriek. What she meant as an attack and a disruption of Aslan's song becomes something else. For a lamppost grows where the rod fell to the grass, and it becomes the lamppost where Lucy meets the fond Mr. Tumnus in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. Aslan restores and recreates the broken rod into what it really was all along, even in its brokenness, as it participates in the divine song. While the others present are struck with wonder, Uncle Andrew totally misses the point. Quote, "I have discovered a world where everything is bursting with life and growth. The commercial possibilities of this country are unbounded," he says. This creation exists for his own selfish purpose, to dominate and exploit for his own gain, as he imagines planting old scraps of iron or steel that will cost him nothing, but will yield a harvest that he can sell in London. The witch and Uncle Andrew are cut from the same cloth, because they are both under the assumption that the created world exists purely for their manipulation and to serve their own glory. Essentially, they seek to tear the tissue of the created order, to sever the Methexis, in order to define themselves as the new ultimate end. Thus, when Jadis is brought to the nothingness of this place before creation, she declares that it is her doom, precisely because there is nothing to manipulate to her own ends. To them, all things are instruments used to the wrong end, the idolatry of self-exaltation, instead of being a means to their proper end, as icons, the things finding their fullness only as expressions of Aslan's beauty and goodness. As a Dante translator, Andrew Frossardi, clarifies, an icon is an image for contemplating a reality that transcends the specific image. So you meditate on the image or the icon and its beauty and the narrative of the saint's life is meant to inspire you towards holy thoughts. The image leads the mind through the senses to direct communion with the intelligibles, he says. An idol is an image to which we are attached for the sake of the image per se. Obviously, one and the same object can be an idol or an icon. Our approach to it is what makes the difference. There's a reason why the show is called American Idol and not American Icon, because the idol is always pointing to itself. Both Jadis and Andrew mistake the ends of the created order. Rather than allowing the created order in all of its wonder and beauty to function as an icon, propelling their thoughts to behold the giver of wonder and beauty itself, they transform the icon into an idol, a cheap reduction of the thing to its material parts in order to manipulate it for selfish gain. Idolatry is, in the end, the exaltation of the self and one's selfish loves. Thus, their attempts to render London or the other possible worlds that could be accessed through the wood between the worlds into their own image really ends up ossifying the world itself, freezing all things within a calculus of vapid sameness as a reflection of themselves. Lewis demonstrates this when Diggory and Polly arrive in Jadis's petrified city of Charn. Here, they note that there is no sound. And the narrator comments, quote, "This place was at least as quiet as the wood between the worlds, but it was a different kind of quietness. The silence of the wood had been rich and warm. You could almost hear the trees growing and full of life. This was a dead, cold, empty silence. It was all so dreary and all so much the same." The two children shortly encounter the wax-like figures of Jadis and her cruel court. They're frozen in a spell. And Diggory brings them all to life by striking a golden bell out of curiosity. Now there is sound, and though it broke in sweetness through the silence, the single note grew to an unbearable singularity, a droning that awakens the frozen Jadis. So that frozen quality of charm, which I am linking to the sin of idolatry, the breaking of the tissue of Methexis, and the desire for domination over created things, Lewis carries over into his depiction of the perpetual winter kingdom of Queen Jadis in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, before Aslan arrives. So the worlds that Jadis dominates and that Uncle Andrew imagines for himself are only parodies of the real living kingdom that Aslan creates and in which he dwells. Because of his own magical experiments, Uncle Andrew is a poor imitation of Jadis, but both are magicians that aspire to be a creator on the same order as Aslan, of magic rings, of armies and kingdoms, and of worlds. They manufacture, but they do not create. In like manner, Melkor in the Silmarillion, and Sauron and the wizard Saruman of the Lord of the Rings are kinds of magicians who seek to be the creator and the center of their own world. There is, of course, a natural and supernatural impulse for human beings to create, for we are made in the image of God. Tolkien calls us sub-creators in this way. But for Tolkien, as it is for Lewis, it is the sin of pride to declare ourselves our own gods, when the sub-creator dangerously aspires to become the creator of their own reality. Evil in Tolkien's mythology is imitative rather than creative. It's a perversion or a twisting away from an original good. With every succession of evil power in Middle-earth, there is an accompanying diminishment, copies of copies. And let me give you an example. When the company of Gandalf and Aragorn and Gimli and Legolas and the newly healed King Theoden arrive at Saruman's tower at Isengard, Tolkien gives us a powerful picture of both this diminishment and the sub-creator's own self-deception about their own power and creation. Isengard was once a beautiful and strong tower of Gondor, where, quote, wise men watched the stars. Again, visible emblems of transcendence. But over the years, quote, Saruman had slowly shaped it to its shifting purposes and made it better, as he thought, being deceived. For all those arts and subtle devices for which he forsook his former wisdom, and which fondly he imagined were his own, came but from Mordor. So that what he made was not only a little copy, a child's model, or a slave's flattery of that vast fortress armory, prison, furnace of great power, Barad-dûr, the dark tower, which suffered no rival and laughed at flattery." End quote. Saruman thinks he has enhanced the glory of the Tower of Orthanc by a power of his own. But the narrator here makes it clear that his power is derivative of Mordor's power, and that his own creation is equivalent to a child's house of cards. There is then the unmistakable pulse of narcissism in Sauron and Saruman as they seek to reduce the glorious multiplicity of all things to the totalitarian singleness of their own will. In the end, Tolkien would have us believe that evil is repetitive, reductive, discordant, and oh so boring. Don't be evil because it's boring. At its base, that's the temptation of the Ring of Power for all who possess and seek to possess it. The exertion and false exaltation of self-will over the wills of others, and the enchanting lie that the possessor of the ring is the ultimate end and the transcendent source that grounds the new conditions of participation. A look at one example may help. If you're familiar with the end of the Fellowship of the Ring and the death of Boromir. Boromir attempts to take the ring from Frodo. He's been skeptical all along of this foolhardy plan to carry the most powerful thing into the very jaws of Mordor itself. And instead, he has suggested along the way we should harness the ring as our own weapon against the enemy. In his ensuing monologue in the presence of Frodo, his motives and reasoning for taking the ring progressively get narrower. First, he insists on the strength of, quote, true-hearted men, and desires the ring as a weapon for Gondor's defense, since it shares a border with Mordor. The ring is thus a gift, as he says, to all the foes of Mordor in this way. Next, he asserts that only the fearless and the ruthless will become victorious. Fearlessness may be a virtue in the right circumstances, but ruthlessness, I'm not so sure. He then pictures himself as the greatest leader, for, quote, the ring would give me power of command, how I would drive the hosts of Mordor, and all men would flock to my banner. In the mere presence of the ring, Boromir has strayed from the motives of national defense to personal glory and singular exaltation. So it is with all those who are tempted by the ring, regardless of their motives. In fact, in a letter, Tolkien states that had Gandalf been the ring bearer, he would have become just as bad for his good intentions as Sauron is with his evil ones, oppressively imposing on the will of others his own desire for pity and righteousness, much like the self-righteous Pharisees of the Gospels, whom Jesus is always confronting. When Frodo disappears and escapes Boromir's presence, the spell is broken. Boromir is left with his shame, but it does not lead him to despair and madness. It leads him to repentance and penance as he gives his life in defense of the weakest in the company, Merry and Pippin. And by doing so, he's overcome by the orcs. It's a mark of his extraordinary character that his last words are a confession of his failure to Aragorn. And Aragorn preserves Boromir's good reputation, as he does not disclose his attack on Frodo to his other companions. While Boromir's selfish grab for the ring marks his exitus, or going out from the fellowship. It's Aragorn's tender pity that accomplishes Boromir's reditus, the return or the restoration of Boromir's place as a great warrior of the fellowship and of all Middle-earth, not just a son of Gondor, buttressing his nation's prideful and fading glory. Boromir fails in his temptation, but he ultimately achieved victory over the ring in and through the sacrifice of his own selfish vision of Methexis towards the reordering of things to their proper end. Last section, I promise, called Love and Methexis. Doing so is then the reordering of what one loves and the degree to which one loves it. In his treatise on music, Augustine states, quote, "The soul possesses order, which is loving what is above itself, that is God, with its whole self and its fellow souls as itself. Indeed, by this virtue of love, it orders inferior things, and it is not soiled by them." So the idea for Augustine is that under grace, one is enabled to participate back in the being of God in a proper way and to love God in a proper way, instead of loving the things of this world in an improper way. So once the soul has reordered its loves and is contemplating and loving the highest of things, it can then properly love all the other things below it. Does that make sense to you guys? That's the idea that Augustine is getting to. Although Tolkien does not use this language, this kind of language in the novel, we might suggest that Boromir has reordered his soul's loves once the seduction of the ring has passed. His temptation scene, fail though he does, is a kind of crucible for accomplishing that kind of soul's labor. In closing, let me point out the prevalence of in-between spaces in The Magician's Nephew. Doors, hallways, attics, courtyards, and most obviously the wood between the worlds. Similarly, one of the earliest lyrics in Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings centers on the novel's most prominent symbol throughout, that of the road. And here's Bilbo's simple lyric that gets introduced early on. "The road goes ever on and on, down from the door where it began. Now far ahead the road has gone, and I must follow if I can, pursuing it with eager feet until it joins some larger way where many paths and errands meet, and whither then, I cannot say." There's a sense of expansiveness in Bilbo's song, as the narrow and the familiar road that one is currently traveling is inevitably bound to a larger and unfamiliar way that opens up to an ever-widening vista of perspective and significance. The good that one is pursuing at the moment on the road of one's journey is inevitably linked to a much larger one whose twists and turns we cannot see. And you might remember that one of Bilbo's early titles for the book that he's writing in his adventures was called There and Back Again. Now, the title for this book undergoes a series of revisions as Bilbo's journey gets ever bigger. And he contemplates the different significance and shifting of the quest. What began simply as him titling it My Diary, Frodo has finished as a book with the epic title The Downfall of the Lord of the Rings and the Return of the King. That's quite a journey. My Diary, that's where it begins, and it ends with the epic. Both Lewis's and Tolkien's novels are about journeying from one place to another, about potential movement in one direction or another, what we might call a liminal space, a threshold. Temptation is a lot like the wood between the worlds, or like a door, or a hallway, or a road, for it is the place of potential movement and a point of crisis for determining what is loved and to what degree. Temptation is the liminal site that is the threshold of methexis, participation. Because temptation shapes desire, where one's actions are inscribed either within the ultimate end of being obedient to the highest good, that is, loving God, or satisfying the marginal end of a much lesser good, loving oneself. So when Diggory finds the silver apples of life that Aslan has commanded that he fetch, he is tempted by Jadis to give it to his sick mother instead of presenting it to Aslan, the one to whom it belongs. And here I think, if you know anything about Lewis's biography, this is a moment when Lewis is confronting his own fears and anger over the early loss of his own mother. Diggory's mother is dying. But evil appears at this moment to Diggory as something good in the witch's temptation. What kind of boy would choose not to heal their mother if it were in his power to do so? And that's how evil often appears to us at the moment of temptation, not in all of its hideousness, but as some kind of gain or good that we define. In our temptation, we move in methexis, either closer to and more like God, and toward that which we were created to be, or further from God, and more like an Uncle Andrew, or a Queen Jadis, or a Sauron, or Saruman. One who, as Aslan describes, quote, has made himself unable to hear my voice. Unable to hear the song of creation. Diggory chooses the song. Obedience to the highest good, not the fulfillment of a lesser good of his own definition. And thereby, he gets more. He was expressly not given the promise by Aslan that if he fetched the silver apple and gave it to its rightful owner, his mother would be healed. It was not a quid pro quo. But in his obedience, he also gets compassion. That's what he gets. He gets the tears of Aslan, weeping because of the pain of death and the reality of sickness. That's what he gets. But in his obedience, he also gets by Aslan's grace the healing of his mother through the gift of a second apple, even as he did not even suspect this to be a possible outcome. Thus, the moment of temptation, the crucible of choice between what one loves and the will to obey the higher love granted Diggory, as it does for us all, a greater love for Aslan himself, and a deeper participation in the love song of the church for its bridegroom. Thank you.